Welcome to Living in Fiction. I'm your host, Arthur Aguirre. I'm a professor in leadership and communication. Living in Fiction is an edutainment podcast where we look at some of the best movies, some of our favorite movies, and some ridiculous movies to see what we've learned to avoid, and what's inspired us. I am continuing my rewatch of The Bear, leading up to the new season that comes out next week already. So I'm pretty pumped about this. Let's go and get started. We are going over episodes 5, 6, and 7. 7 being my favorite episode, a lot of people's favorite episode. So let's go ahead and get started. Episode 5, called Pop. Work continues at the restaurant. We get a closer look at Tina in culinary school. Carmen spends some more time with Claire, and Richie gets into a power struggle with Natalie. Couple things to note. One, and I mentioned this at the very beginning, you have to start building a culture in your organization. And sometimes that should be very intentional, but there are some things that are going to happen unintentionally, right? The fact that Tina calls Carmen Jeff, that is now stuck as part of the lexicon. That is now a communication rule for this business. You know, she calls him Jeffrey. I think in episode 1 of season 2, Sweeps calls him Jefferson, right? This is now just a part, like this is one aspect of this new business that they're creating. So I want you to keep that in mind when you're part of an organization and try to pay attention to what some of these spoken or unspoken rules of communication are, because they will come out naturally like this. Obviously, this is all written, but things like this happen all the time. And you should pay attention to those things, especially if you're trying to connect with people within an organization, especially if you're a brand new leader in that organization. The main focus of this episode, and there's a couple things I'll talk about at the very end here, but the main focus for this episode that I want to talk about, it's some similarities between this episode 5 and episode 7. This one I really like focusing on Tina. Her journey up until this point, from the beginning of season 1 all the way up until this episode, is a really great example of how you create a connection and build a relationship and develop a team member, especially one that was hesitant at the very beginning. All she talked about at the very beginning was not messing with the system. And slowly over time, you know, she butted heads with Sydney especially, but over time they connected. Once she started seeing where they were going and the different way things felt with this new system in a positive way. At one point, she talks about that it's not just good there, like, I have gotten better. And if you can see yourself developing, if your team can see themselves developing, in addition to getting whatever work that there is done, that is a strong combination and a foundation in morale, leadership development, and just building a link between your team members and your business, and allowing them to see themselves develop alongside that new business. They can see their place and where it goes and how well it functions if they are operating at a high level. But you have to give them an opportunity. You have to be patient. It took Sydney troubleshooting that relationship with Tina. And then once they built that relationship, at the very least of respect, then they started building on that. One thing that stuck out to me, you know, at this point, you know, she's in culinary school. We see a glimpse of her getting to know her cohort there. But at the very beginning, Carmen gives her his knife. And you can see that's just like another step in her development and in her buying in completely into this brand new system that a lot of people, especially regardless of your industry, have a hard time dealing with. And she is just jumping in head first. Not just, and I made a note here, it's not just about developing her skills, but slowly integrating her into a new culture you're building. All of these things, the pushback, everything, even her conversation with Richie in the alley, all of these things are a clear buildup to her finally feeling at home. And that's what you want to do with your team. People say all the time that folks don't quit jobs, they quit managers. And so if you can create that relationship of respect, but still find a purpose for that person, but for themselves, not just within the organization. Man, there is no limit to the possibilities of a team member like that on your team. And they're also still trying to, in this episode, get Richie to buy in, because he clearly isn't. Richie continues to argue with Natalie. He's arguing with Sydney, and you can see where they're coming from and where, like, what sides they're taking and what's informing their positions, right? Richie says, "I've been here since the beginning. You've been here 2 seconds. Have some respect, kid." I mean, in terms of his tenure there in the restaurant, calling her kid, there's so many dynamics involved, but you can see where he's coming from. You know, that mentality of, I was here before you. This is my place. You're just a guest here. You're brand new here. You can just see that struggle, that it's just still not making sense for him, and he's not finding his place. You know, we heard at the first episode of season 2 that he's struggling to find his purpose. And we can see Carmen trying to figure that out, but Nat, she's got all her stuff, you know, all her own stuff that she's dealing with. But at one point she tells Sydney, "Richie has no skills or abilities to speak of, so I'm trying to task him with things that, even if they get fucked up, won't bite me in the ass." That is a harsh thing to say about someone, right? That is not even accounting for whatever interpersonal skills or, you know, whatever soft skills that they may have that are a benefit. She's not even open to those types of opportunities. Now, granted, he's not doing himself any favors, but you can see that struggle in this episode. You can see the difference between getting someone to buy in slowly over time and how that can work. And you're seeing how using similar methods won't work with someone who is not just digging their heels in, but trying to pull things back whenever they have an opportunity. So that's what stuck out to me in episode 5. Keep some of those things in mind, because I will bring up, particularly the Richie stuff, episode 7. So let's go ahead and move on to episode 6. Episode 6, Fishes, probably one of the most stressful episodes of either season. We get a closer look at the Berzatto family dynamic that shaped Michael, Carmen, Natalie, Richie, and pretty much everyone at that table. I won't get into too many specifics. There's a few things that stuck out to me in particular. Carmen thinking that Michael didn't care because he wasn't answering the phone or anything, and Michael having to say, I give a huge fuck, I give the biggest fuck about Carmen and what's going on. Later on, Michelle invites Carmen to stay with her for a couple weeks in San Francisco to get him out of the house, because they can see how chaotic everything is. You can see through that people like Michael, like Michelle, probably like Natalie, can see Carmen's potential already at this dinner, or leading up to this dinner, and they want to almost like save him from the family and make sure that he can succeed in whatever way that they foresee for him to do. Michael, I mean, it's clear now that we're looking at everything in hindsight that Michael is trying to keep Carmen away from the restaurant because he's like, I don't want to taint that, right? That's a mentality of like, I don't want to mess this person up. I can see how bright their future is. And Michelle's doing the same thing, like, just stay with me. I can give you all these opportunities because you have so much potential. I don't want anything to get in the way of that. The other thing I want to talk about is a conversation Richie has with Jimmy where he's asking him for a job, because as he's trying to pitch himself, he mentions that, I'm good with people. I don't know what to do with that. At the very least, he can acknowledge that is a skill that he has. Keep that in mind for when we're talking about episode 7. But what I really wanted to dive into after an episode like this is, first of all, conflict. There are different ways of handling conflict. You can completely avoid the situation. You can accommodate where you're kind of completely giving in to that person, which in this episode, there's a lot of that going on. We can see competition, which we see that between Lee and Michael. We see reactivity, right? Just explosiveness. And we see that with Michael, with Donna. We're seeing a little bit with Lee. And ideally, in any kind of conflict with family members, you're looking for collaboration, right? Trying to come up with new solutions. In that moment, though, with all these different dynamics where we're thinking about alcohol and whatever other drugs that might be going on, that can make things pretty challenging. But the thing you really want to avoid is that reactivity. If you find yourself reacting in a very intense way during a conflict, it might be a good idea for you to remove yourself for a little bit, calm down, and then try to re-engage once everybody's cooled down a little bit. But those are the different ways that you can handle conflict. And ideally, collaboration takes more time, but it's about getting to know each other a little bit better and really trying to understand the person's position, rather than trying to argue or say negative things, kind of the way that Lee was saying negative things about Michael instead of just having a conversation. Now, again, these things aren't, one for one in terms of how you apply them, because when you're having an argument on an issue, that's one thing. But when you are just combative, the way that Lee and Michael were, the way that Donna can be with just everybody, it can be really challenging. And sometimes the solutions aren't, it feels like it's a no-win situation. Before getting into that dire of a situation, in terms of how to maintain a relationship regardless of conflict, there's a few ways you can do that. One is positivity, focusing on the positive aspects of the person and your relationship. It doesn't mean you sugarcoat things or avoid negative aspects, but it means that in those moments, as often as you can, you focus on the positive. Assurances, parents all the time, it's not that you're a bad kid, you did a bad thing, right? Or I'm just worried about this. You're letting them know, like, just because I'm upset at something that you're doing or that you said, it doesn't mean that I don't love you, right? That's a type of assurance. And then self-disclosure, sharing a little bit more about yourself. And we see bits and pieces of that, particularly when we see Michael and Carmen in the pantry. So those are all small ways that you can try to maintain your family relationships. Because when it comes to the dynamic of the family, there's usually a couple relational dialectics that come into play when it comes to family. So one is autonomy versus connection. We are always striving for our independence, but as human beings, we want to connect. We want to be able to rely on our family members. So there is a constant struggle between those two aspects of ourselves. And there's also a struggle between openness and protection. I want to be as open and free in this relationship as I can, right? But I also want to protect my own individuality, like things that I want to keep private. And so those are two dynamics that you have to continue to think about when it comes to maintaining a family relationship, when you're trying to offer the positivity and the assurances, and even especially with the self-disclosure and trying to balance the openness and the protection part of it. It can be very complicated, right? But we love our family, right? Part of loving someone is working on yourself for that person. All that being said, you could be really great at all those things. You can get really good at conflict and maintaining your family and setting your own boundaries, but you have no control of what other people are going to do. You could see in this episode people trying to look out for Donna. I'll focus on her. And they're just not, like, she is just not seeing that. And there's a lot, there's mental health issues going on, there's addiction going on, there's a lot. And what I want to end this with, and listen to me, if there is someone that you know and you love, a family member or a friend, and they are completely disregarding your boundaries, and there's love there, but the care part of it does not seem to be there anymore, and that relationship no longer serves you for the better, you do not have to talk to them. And I know there are cultural things that are involved. In my culture, you always respect your elders no matter what. That was great up until I hit a certain age. And now I am much more clear with my boundaries. Now, that doesn't mean I'm cutting people off. For me, it means that I know that there are certain subjects I won't talk to with certain people. It means that I limit my time with certain people. And whether it is just their presence makes you nervous or anxious, or they're as combative as Donna, that is for you to decide. It is a completely subjective thing. Now, it is helpful if you have some people in your life that you can bounce these ideas off of and bounce these scenarios off of, so they understand the situation and maybe they can help you troubleshoot if you're going too far with your boundaries or whatever that might be. But you do not need to talk and be cool with everyone. Doesn't matter. Family, not family. Like, life is way too short, man. Like, why would you keep terrible people in your life? Now, all that being said, obviously we're in not a bubble here, but, you your family and your parents, like that can be really challenging. I know people who have that struggle of what kind of boundary they have to keep with their parents. But I also know people who finally reached a point and said, this relationship with this parent is not working anymore. This trying to maintain this is making things worse, or this person has crossed a line that there's no coming back from. It is okay for you to decide that. Clearly they are trying in this episode, where we're going back to talking about the bear, but in this episode, you can tell that they are trying and doing whatever they can to put together a relationship with Donna in whatever way makes sense, that, given exactly who she is. But episode aside, like, you have to decide that for yourself. And I know it can be hard, but there are just some people that just, you just can't figure that out. They can't figure that out. So that's for you to decide. But from that is like the biggest message that stuck out to me when I was watching this episode is there are some relationships that you do not have to keep, and that's okay. All right. Lastly, let's talk about episode 7, my favorite episode, Forks. This whole episode focuses on Richie staging at the best restaurant in the world. I'm going to start by playing this clip that the episode starts with because Sydney's been reaching Coach K's book, so I'm going to play that real quick.
The very first thing is that, in order to get better, you change limits. And when you change limits, you're going to look bad and you're going to fail. And at West Point, I learned that failure was never a destination. In other words, when you are knocked back, figure out why and then change. The other thing is that you're not going to get there alone. Be on a team. Surround yourself with good people and learn how to listen. Don't. You're not going to learn with you just talking. And when you do talk, converse. Don't make excuses. Figure out the solution, and you don't have to figure it out yourself.
I wanted to start with that clip because I think it is a good representation of Richie's journey from the beginning of the show, period, up until this episode. When you change limits, you fail. Failure is not a destination. You're not going to get there alone. Be on a team. There is something really special about the way that they put this episode together, and they kind of created this arc for Richie. But I like it because you're seeing Carmen try to develop him very similarly, but in their own special way, in a way that makes sense for someone like Richie. Similarly to how Sydney was developing Tina. But those are two different people who were clearly in different phases of hesitation in terms of this new vision for the restaurant. But Carmen sends Richie to this fantastic restaurant, and at first he's just cleaning forks, and he continues to question the way people are doing things. And then Garrett tells them, this every day is a freaking Super Bowl, and we want to blow people's minds basically every night. And then Richie sees that in action, and that's it. Once he realizes it's not about the restaurant, it's not just about cooking good food, it is about the experience and making people happy. And you can tell that's what she's saying. He wants to make people happy through his stories, through his jokes. He wants to make people happy. It is just so important for people to have a purpose. And Richie didn't have one until this episode. And you can just see it when it locks in. And it's funny because that's why I mentioned the episode 6 when Richie is talking to Jimmy and he's trying to pitch himself that, he wants a job. He says, I'm good with people. I don't know what to do with that. And you get to the end of this episode, it's just an incredible episode. And he's talking to Chef Terry, and he apologizes. He's like, I know he had to pull a favor, and she said, I don't do favors. And he says, he believes in you. He's like, how do you know that? And she's like, because he told me. And then she says, he said you're good with people. He's not wrong. And that's exactly what he told Jimmy. Right? So he found a way to get this skill that he knows he's good at and turn it into his purpose in this restaurant. And he wants to do it there at this, he gets to the end of his week and he wants to stay there, but clearly he can't. And we see how it plays out. And if you've seen this before, you know how it plays out, but you can look at episode 5 and you can look at episode 7, and there are clear examples of how you can get people to buy in and get people to want to be motivated and excited to work for you. So that's all I have for today. I hope you enjoyed it. We're wrapping up next week. We're going over the last 3 episodes of season 2, and then it's on to season 3, where I'll be doing 1 episode at a time. So thank you for joining me, and I will see you all next week.